everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Thursday, the 11th. And we are in the midst of talking about persuasion, and we are also in the midst of thinking about paper number 1. So as you know, I had indicated that I've got flexible due dates for the paper, though our target due date is the 16th of June, which is this upcoming Tuesday, which would put us a little bit past halfway through the semester. So I think that would be a good time for you to write a paper, though I always encourage early papers, and certainly you can hand in a paper after that. But do keep in mind that by the beginning of July, we will be done with the class. So the sooner the better. And as you know, you can write on any of the texts that we've discussed thus far, and that would be literary texts. So even though The Cult of True Womanhood was our first text, that was merely background. In terms of fiction, we have read The Story of an Hour, though writing about a short story requires a lot more attention to detail. And then, of course, we read Frankenstein and discussed it, and now we are in the midst of persuasion. And over the last couple of classes, I've talked a little bit about some of the conventions of writing a paper, and I have suggested to you to write a paper on one of the quotations from The Cult of True Womanhood, that a book could ruin a girl. Though, if you have other ideas, as long as you get that idea approved by me and it is based on one of the texts that we have discussed in class, as then you could proceed in that way. And in terms of thinking about the evaluation for the paper, I direct you again to our syllabus and other documents folder, where at the ending of our syllabus, what I had done is I had given a criteria for essay evaluation that I just wanted to talk briefly about. So the sense of an A paper, an excellent paper, is that it develops a clear sense of audience, a clear central idea with originality and depth of thought, and its topic is developed with clear and logical supporting ideas. The organization is sound. Paragraphs have core ideas supported by fitting examples and illustrations. And paragraphs are joined to those following and those before with smooth links and transitions. Sentences are well put together and varied, and the paper is generally free of common errors in grammar, punctuation, and spelling. So the idea is that you've got a strong thesis, which can be identified in the opening paragraph, which should also list the name of the author and the name of the text that you are discussing. The thesis should be about a position that reasonable people could disagree about. And you're making sure that all of your paragraphs are developed. So that means a minimum of 3 sentences. And usually the introductory sentence of each paragraph, known as the topic sentence, serves as a kind of summary of what that paragraph is about. So that could give a sense of direction, a kind of outline, if you will, to your paper. And then what you do in your body paragraphs, of course, is where you give evidence and reference from the text. Sometimes you'll be using direct quotation. Sometimes you will be using paraphrase. Sometimes you will be using a combination of the two. In terms of direct quotation, we are using the MLA, or Modern Language Association, style guide for writing a paper, which means that at the ending of a quote, immediately after the ending of a quote, whether you finish your sentence or not, you give parentheses, and within the parentheses, you list the least amount of information necessary for a reader to be able to identify where that quote comes from. Oftentimes, that's just a page number. If you are working with an electronic source, oftentimes that's just the author's surname. But there are different variables that can be involved. For instance, if you've got multiple texts by the same author, you might have the author's surname and then the name of the text. And all of this is something that you could find in any style book for the Modern Language Association, though I recommend the GCC Library website. I've also recommended Purdue OWL in terms of documentation. And the thing with documentation is that it all comes together with the works cited page, which is at the ending of the paper. And the works cited page is literally just that, a page of all of the works that you've cited or you're quoted within the paper. And all of those works are listed in alphabetical order, beginning with author's surname. And there are small differences on how you would list a book as opposed to a website, as opposed to a magazine article. And those are the things you look up in the MLA, almost like a kind of cookbook, where you would look up your specific instance and just follow the directions exactly. Now, since I'm asking for a critical paper, which means that you are not using outside sources, as far as I'm concerned, you don't necessarily need to add a works cited page because you would have identified in your introduction the name of the text and the name of the author. So certainly you can add a works cited page that would give all of that information. And if you do so, you want to make sure that you're documenting correctly. Again, you can look at the MLA website on the GCC library site or Purdue OWL or any of a number of places. I suspect that this is something that you've heard before in other English classes, so I don't want to belabor the point. But since you aren't relying on any external outside sources, you don't really need, as far as I'm concerned, to include the works cited page. You do need to do the parenthetical documentation, which means inside of the body of the paper itself, immediately after a quote, whether you have finished the quote or not, you use parentheses, and within those parentheses, you give the page number or whatever the case may happen to be. And in terms of thinking about how to go about determining what to quote, one of the things that I oftentimes would do that helped me, at least with writing a paper, is that once I had a general sense of what it was I was going to be talking about, I gathered all of the quotes that I could find in the text related to that topic. And then I organized those quotes in the order in which I thought I might want to discuss them. And then what I did was I constructed paragraphs around those quotes and my discussion of the importance of those quotes. What I ended up with was a draft. And as we talked about with writing a paper, you want to write a paper in stages rather than write it all in one sitting. And certainly you want to use the learning that you have gotten from our class, whether it be the discussion forum responses from your classmates and my responses in turn, or the class videos, or a combination of the two, as well as your own ideas and your own thoughts. So in terms of the A paper, this is a paper that basically has all of those elements, and that's what an excellent would be. A B paper is a good paper. So basically, a B paper has a clearly stated central idea. It doesn't have the energy, perhaps, or the depth of thought of an A paper. It draws safe conclusions. The topic is interesting. It's focused adequately, logically developed. Organization is correct and organization is correct and logical, but strains a little bit. Each paragraph has a central idea, examples or illustrations, and a logical point. Some of the transitions are smooth between paragraphs, but some are not. Sentences have little variety in structure. You remember we talked about that. You want to vary sentence beginnings, for instance, and do a mix of some shorter sentences and some longer sentences. And the paper is largely free of errors in grammar, spelling, and punctuation, but there might be some errors in there. The C paper, which is satisfactory, has a reasonably clear central idea, and it shows adequate grasp of the reason for the assignment. So basically, you've answered the question of the assignment, but the focus is blurred in some places. The development with examples or illustrations is sketchy in some points. Organization isn't always clear. Most paragraphs have a sense of organization, but development is vague. Transitions between paragraphs are awkward, sometimes even lacking. And now we're beginning to see patterns of mistakes in grammar, spelling, punctuation, and documentation. The D paper doesn't necessarily state or develop a central idea, though the pattern shows that the writer has at least some idea or concept of what the paper is about. The sense of audience is inconsistent. Organization is hard to follow. Frequently, paragraphs seem to lack a central idea. Transitions between paragraphs are scanty or even absent. Sentences are awkward, incorrectly constructed. It does not indicate college level proficiency, and you're seeing frequent errors now in grammar, punctuation, spelling, and documentation. And the F paper states no central idea and has no connection to a single topic. The writing is contradictory, characterized by many apparent changes of subject. No overall evidence of editing beyond a first draft stage. Most sentences have errors in construction. Now, everybody has the opportunity to rewrite the first paper after I review it. And I'll be looking for those elements as well as the elements that I've talked about in earlier videos about how to write a paper and some of the expectations of a paper. And then when I return it to you, if it turns out that you would like to improve your grade, you can submit in a revision. I just ask that you submit in the original with my commentary along with your revision so I can compare and contrast the two. And I think I'm going to sneeze. No, I'm not going to sneeze. Okay. And it turns out that you've got up until the ending of the semester to submit in that revision, but the sooner the better. So you may want to write about persuasion, which is why I wanted to put some closure onto persuasion today, because that is one of the possibilities. And as you know, we talked about characters last class. This class, I wanted to talk a little bit about the two volumes into which the novel is divided. And volume 1, of course, is where we're getting introduced to all of these characters, or most of these characters, I should say. And the text, as we had talked about, is definitely a satire on what life is like for those who have inherited wealth. And it seems that it's not necessarily a particularly good thing to have inherited wealth, at least from the perspective of being able to be intellectually curious or help other individuals or have some sort of active impact on the world itself, as evidenced through Sir Walter and his family. With the exception of Anne, and we're really getting her perspective throughout the story, and this is where we get her very subtle persuasion, hence the title, showing us about the negatives of that kind of family structure. And of course, she herself has also been subject to persuasion because this kind of societal structure emphasizes marriage for social reasons and economic reasons, not necessarily romantic reasons. And Anne was persuaded not to follow her heart because the man that she loved, Frederick Wentworth, didn't have social status and he didn't have money. Now, note that as the novel progresses and we see Frederick Wentworth with Anne years later, Frederick has status, Frederick has money. He's went and he's found his worth, so to speak. And this is a spoiler alert because I'm hopeful you would have finished the novel by now. Anne and Wentworth do end up together at the ending of the novel. So it's a quote, happy ending, unquote. I can't help but wonder though, would we have gotten this ending if Frederick was not wealthy and if Frederick did not have social status in the military? And probably not. So, there are problems with the progressive ideas that are beginning to be examined, and we will see them examined in much more depth and detail as the novels progress. We are shown right from the very beginning in Volume 1 the importance of decorum and appearance when Sir Eliot is looking at the Bartonage, which is basically a book that lists all of the individuals who have nobility and their family lines. And the sense, too, that he is so obsessed with mirrors. Notice how frequently mirrors appear. The idea of basically appearance being the most important. The baronage talks about all the orders of nobility, and Sir Eliot is a baron. He's the lowest order of British nobility. And we learn about his wife, Lady Eliot, and a wonderful quote, I think, is that she had humored or softened or concealed Sir Walter's failings, and though not the very happiest being in the world herself, had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach her to life. And I think about that in the context of what we had talked about in the Cult of True Womanhood, about the role of female in society. And she has passed, it's been 13 years now, which is somewhat of an ominous number. And Sir Walter, without her guiding hand, has now found himself in deep financial difficulties, which is part of what starts the action in the novel. And we're introduced to his three daughters. He doesn't have a male heir, and that is important, as we know, because if he were to remarry and have an heir, that would completely change the structure of the inheritance. He has an oldest who is 29, on the cusp of 30, so that could be viewed as past marriageable age, but that's not the way he sees it, because he sees Elizabeth being very helpful to him in terms of serving as the lady of the house. And he's not terribly worried about his youngest daughter, Mary. She's already married into a respectable family. They had fortune, but not nobility. And of course, ideally, you would have both. And he is somewhat concerned about Anne, who is 27, so she's nearing her 30s. Again, notice the hypocrisy that he would be concerned about Anne, yet not be concerned about Elizabeth, even though both of them are unmarried at this point. And according to him, Anne has lost her bloom, her youthful beauty, which is something that she'll regain as she begins to interact with other individuals and it begins to become intellectually and physically stimulated, rather than just going through um, the dance of social decorum. So Walter Elliot talks about his fear of the Navy bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction. The idea, and keep in mind this is a British novel, that ultimately status and rank were determined through birthright, very different in the United States. And Sir Walter, I think, was able to anticipate some of the ways that military, both in Britain and in the United States, would lead to a whole new way of characterizing success in society. And of course, because of the concern for appearances, the family decides to, quote, vacation, unquote, in Bath, which allows them to save face and to rent out their property, which means that they can get some money from their property. And this is where we're introduced to other characters. And again, because as I had mentioned last class, geography was such a major issue that people's social circles were very small, and oftentimes their social circles were their familial circles as well. We learn about the Musgroves because Mary Elliott, the youngest, has married into the Musgrove family. And while they have wealth, again, they don't have status, but they're very different in their perceptions of the world. They have hobbies, they have interests, and they even allow their own daughters to court and marry on their own. They're not too worried about the idea of making a good match. And as Anne Elliot spends more time with the Musgroves, she sees that there's just a very different way of living life. And this is where Anne begins to, quote, regain her bloom, unquote. The Musgrove family begins to rely on Anne. One of the things we see in the Elliot family is that they don't really hold Anne in much respect, and they don't really think much of her opinions. Things are very different with the Musgroves, so they appreciate her value. And the Musgroves are going to be connected through Frederick Wentworth. Remember him? That was Anne's former love that she was unable to accept the proposal from her perspective, because he hadn't achieved rank and status. They're connected to Frederick Wentworth through their dead son. It turns out the Musgroves have a son named Richard who died in the military, and he was under Frederick Wentworth. So you'll see how everybody is connected. And one of the things that I had suggested to you to look at is falling. That's one of the major themes in this play, or I'm sorry, in this novel. Um, People are falling off of, let's say, walls. People are falling in love, if you will. The idea is balance. And this is something that Wentworth has to learn himself as he begins, upon his return, to start to seriously look for a spouse. And one of the first episodes that we see with Wentworth is when he's with Anne, and little Charles Musgrove, one of the children of the Musgrove family, falls. Here's that falling. Dislocates his shoulder, his collarbone, I should say, and neither parent wants to stay to care for him. So we learn a lot about the duties of motherhood through Mary, who is a rather unattractive character. She's whiny and self centered and very much concerned about her welfare and comfort, though she's not cold or mean spirited in the way that Elizabeth is. And it turns out that Mary has some very interesting dialogue about why is it that she's expected to stay home and care for her sick child or her hurt child when her husband is allowed to socialize and meet this newcomer, Frederick Wentworth, in town. They both end up going, and then it turns out that Anne is left to care for the child. We're introduced to the Croft family, Admiral and Mrs. Croft, no children. This is a marriage that's based purely on love, not necessarily money, not necessarily connections, not necessarily on fertility. And Mrs. Croft talks about one of the worst things in a marriage is separation. So this is a very different kind of marital situation. The major excitement is that they get to visit not only Wentworth, but they get to visit Wentworth's friends, which are completely out of their circle. So new people and certainly new possibilities for romance. Wentworth's friends, the Harvilles, they live in Lyme, and they're similar to the Musgroves in the sense that they don't have nobility, but they do have interests and hobbies and are much more down to earth, much more like Anne than the rest of the Elliot family. And we know that at one point, Wentworth is thinking about that he can court Louisa Musgrove, one of the Musgrove daughters, who happens to be eligible and single, because she's got a strong will, unlike Aunt Elliot, who is so easily persuaded not to marry. However, Louisa's will is so strong that she walks on a wall and falls off of it because of her impulsivity. She ends up recuperating at the Harvilles. And this shows again that Louisa is one extreme. You can be too daring, too willful. But then there's the other extreme, which is too passive. The idea is to get someplace in the middle. And in volume 2, we return to Sir Walter. We hadn't seen him for quite a while now. And this is where we are told about William Elliot, who is the heir presumptive to the family. He is the closest direct male heir. He returns to the Elliot family circle. It seems that there has been an offense, or at least a social faux pas that occurred in the past, so he really isn't connected to the family. And now he returns to the family, and he's eligible because his wife has passed away. He married for money. And now that he has money, what he wants is title. So what he's after is the Elliot family name. And he's interested in Anne in part because she is an interesting person, but in bigger part, it's because she has the familial name. And Anne eventually figures that out, that that's really his major motivator, that he doesn't have much character, that he's rather shallow, that he's more similar to Sir Walter than different. And while Anne is getting out in the world and is being appreciated, it's not just by Mr. Elliot. It's Frederick Wentworth is also starting to pay very close attention to Anne, especially when he realizes that Louisa is too much of the extreme of, or the opposite of what Anne is. And a Captain Benwick, who is visiting the Harvilles, and it turns out that his fiancée died. So that's the reason why he's with the Harvilles, because that was the Harvilles' sister. And now the question is, how long will he grieve? And Coincidentally, perhaps, it just so turns out that Louisa is recovering there. Louisa spends enough time in the household with Captain Benwick that they end up becoming a couple, even though they seem to be polar opposites, where um, Benwick is much more of an intellectual and much more brooding, and Louisa seems to be much more active and much more impulsive, and perhaps they'll both temper each other. The idea of opposites attract, and they'll meet someplace in the middle, again, sort of avoiding the extremes and finding balance. We're introduced to the Viscountess Dalrymple, who is a superior to Sir Walter, and he acts in the way one can predict he would act. He's superior and pompous to everyone until he gets to someone who is above his station, and then he becomes very different. He's trying to earn the Viscountess's favor. And Anne is quite embarrassed by all of this behavior. Um, and in fact, she says she was ashamed of her family, preferring the company of clever, well informed people who had a great deal of conversation, which at the time would be rather progressive from somebody of Anne's social status, rather than being concerned with birth, education, and manners, which is what we see with the Elliots. And we see Anne actually practicing this when she maintains a friendship with Mrs. Smith. Smith being a very common name, so she's supposed to represent a common individual. She has no status. She's only a Mrs. She's a widow, but she's a widow who is poor because there wasn't an estate. It turns out that her husband had also been led to financial ruin by, of all people, we will find out. Here's our twist. Mr. Elliot. It turns out that they were close friends, Mr. William Elliot. But now Mrs. Smith is a, quote, poor, infirm, helpless widow living in Westgate Buildings. So we'll see how all of this comes together when Anne is, because she is human, tempted to perhaps marry William Elliot. That would mean that Anne could become Lady Elliot. She could take her mother's place at Kellynch Hall. But she can't do it because she knows that William Elliot is rational, discreet, polished, but not open. And after we learn that Benwick and Louisa are to marry, Wentworth talks a little bit about how men don't recover from devotion of the heart to women they truly love, or at least they ought not to. This was in reference to Benwick being able to move on so quickly with Louisa, but it also is in reference to the idea that Wentworth still has feelings for Anne. And we know that Anne also has feelings for Wentworth, which is what we are going to be finding by the ending of the novel. So Mrs. Smith, we find out through backstory, through exposition, was friends with Mr. Elliot, who brought her deceased husband to financial ruin and now refuses to help her secure a small inheritance of property. This is important because it goes to show how little power. Certainly, women didn't have any kind of legal autonomy at the time. And all the evidence of all of this is in letters that Mrs. Smith can show Anne. And this might bring back some memories of Frankenstein and the idea of being given information through letters. Henrietta, the other daughter of the Musgrove family, will end up marrying Charles Hayter, who doesn't necessarily have money or status, but he's going to be a pastor, and that was considered to be godly enough to make up for the deficiencies of money or status. Mrs. Croft says something to the effect of that she'd rather have young people settle on a small income at once and have to struggle with a few difficulties together than be involved in a long engagement. And, the idea is that ultimately, if a union is appropriate, not for just financial reasons or for economic reasons, but for reasons of the heart, then it would be better if the couple were to marry and experience life together, even with financial difficulties, than wait and risk the possibility of something going wrong, which is exactly what happens with Captain Benwick. He waited so long to marry the Harville sister, Fanny Harville, that she ended up dying before he could. So Anne talks about, and this I think is a very important quote. This is towards the ending of the novel, and I think it's really where the author tries to express her own opinion in a very clear fashion, that men have the advantage of us, meaning women, in telling their own story. All the privilege I claim for my own sex is that of loving the longest, when existence or when hope is gone. So this is in the notes below in the section for the second book. And you'll notice that in this quote, there is a square bracket with the word women. And square brackets are inserted in, they were not part of the original quote, but they're inserted in by the writer who's quoting the quote, in other words, me, to clarify something that is or could be read as unclear based on just the quote that was selected. So oftentimes it's about pronouns, us, we, you, he, she. So after the word us, in square brackets, I inserted the word women. And because I use square brackets, that would notify you that that was my addition, not part of the original quote. And then close the square brackets. You don't use square brackets to talk about the relevance of a quote. You can do that before or after, but you don't have to do that, certainly, unless you want to clarify something that could be very, very unclear to a reader. And usually it's either an error of information or it's a pronoun that's unclear. You might have also noticed in that quote there is an ellipsis, which is the three periods or the three dots as they're fondly known. Actually, there's two of them. And whenever you see those inside of a quote, that means a word or several words were left out of the quote. So this is how you could determine, if you went to the original quote, that I added in the word women and I also left out a few words, not because I wanted to change the meaning of the quote, but because I thought that it just wasn't relevant to what was being quoted. So those are some of the ways that you can change quotes through using punctuation. Again, you can see this in Purdue OWL and in the GCC Library website. And again, I'm hopeful that this is all review for you. And Anne says, if I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember that it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. And I was right in submitting to her. In this instance, she's talking about the family friend, Lady Russell, who is a widow and doesn't really need to remarry because she has an estate and serves as a kind of mother figure to Anne. And if I'd done otherwise, I would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, because I would have suffered in my conscience. So we've got an author here who is more progressive, perhaps, than Mary Shelley, but less progressive than someone like Charlotte Bronte when we read Jane Eyre. The plot twist is that Mr. Elliot ends up with, of all people, Mrs. Clay. We know that Mrs. Clay is a character who is introduced, and she is the daughter of the family lawyer. She is divorced, and the concern is that she's spending so much time at the Elliot household because she's friends with Elizabeth that perhaps Mrs. Clay has designs on Sir Walter Elliot, which means that she would get money, or at least she would think she would get money, because not many people are aware of the financial situation. Though if anybody's going to be aware of it, it might be Mrs. Clay, because her father is the family attorney after all. But more importantly, what Mrs. Clay would get is that she would no longer be a Mrs. Clay. She would be a Lady Elliot, which means that she would have rank and status. And of course, if an heir was produced, that means, of course, any inheritance would go to their male heir. And the happy ending, Anne and Frederick Wentworth, they marry. And he ends up assisting Mrs. Smith so that she can get some of her property, so that she doesn't have to live in poverty. And that's pretty much, our conversation about persuasion, though we could spend an entire semester talking about any of these pieces if we so wanted to. But I'm aware of the time, and I know that Jane Eyre is a long text, but I think you'll find that it goes much more quickly, and I've always found Jane Eyre to be one of my favorite texts. Jane Eyre is just a fascinating character. And the link for Jane Eyre is below, but of course I've ordered texts for the class as well. And our attendance question today is getting us back to persuasion, because our last attendance question was asking you to think about paper number 1. This attendance question is specifically about persuasion. This will be due on Saturday the 13th. And certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. And the idea is that you don't have to respond to your peers, but you do need to read their responses and my responses in turn. That'll give you a good idea what we would have talked about in class discussion. So for persuasion, I'm asking you to identify an interesting quote in persuasion and indicate, this is the more important piece, why you find it to be interesting. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class, putting any closure that's necessary on persuasion and paper number 1, and then we can talk about Jane Eyre. Take care and talk to you next week. Bye-bye.